Welcome to my latest study on Daniel's Fourth Kingdom and Antichrist. I'll be reading from Romanism and the Reformation by H. Grattan Guinness. H. Grattan Guinness was a 19th century preacher and theologian, and he wrote extensively on Romanism and its effect on the Protestant Reformation. In his book Romanism and the Reformation, I'm going to be reading chapter 5, titled Interpretation and Use of These Prophecies in Pre-Reformation Times. I'll start my reading on page 83. With many varieties as to detail, we find there have existed, and still exist, two great opposite schools of interpretation: the papal and the Protestant, or the futurist and the historical. The latter regards the prophecies of Daniel, Paul, and John as fully and faithfully setting forth the entire course of Christian history. The former as dealing chiefly with a future fragment of time at its close. The former, or futurist system of interpreting the prophecies is now held, strange to say, by many Protestants. But it was first invented by the Jesuit Ribera at the end of the 16th century, to relieve the papacy from the terrible stigma cast upon it by the Protestant interpretation. This interpretation was so evidently the true and intended one that the adherents of the papacy felt its edge must at any cost be turned or blunted. If the papacy were the predicted Antichrist as Protestants asserted, there was an end of the question, and separation from it became an imperative duty. There were only two alternatives. If the Antichrist were not a present power, he must be either past or a future one. Some writers asserted that the predictions pointed back to Nero. This did not take into account the obvious fact that the anti-Christian power predicted was to succeed the fall of the Caesars and develop among the Gothic nations. The other alternative became therefore the popular one with papists. Antichrist was future, so Ribera and Bossuet and others taught. An individual man was intended, not a dynasty. The duration of his power would not be for 12.5 centuries, but only 3.5 years. He would be an open foe to Christ, not a false friend. He would be a Jew and sit in the Jewish temple. Speculation about the future took the place of study of the past and present, and careful comparison of the facts of history with the predictions of prophecy. This related, so it was asserted, not to the main course of the history of the Church, but only to the few closing years of her history. The papal head of the Church of Rome was not the power delineated by Daniel and St. John, accurately as it answered to the description. It was not the criminal indicated. It must be allowed to go free, and the detective must look out for another man who was sure to turn up by and by. The historic interpretation was of course rejected with intense and bitter scorn by the church it denounced as Babylon, and the power it branded as Antichrist, and it's still opposed by all who in any way uphold these. It is held by many that the historic school or interpretation is represented only by a small modern section of the church. We shall show that it has existed from the beginning and includes the larger part of the greatest and best teachers of the Church for 1800 years. We shall show that the fathers of the Church belonged to it, that the most learned medieval commentators belonged to it, that the confessors, reformers, martyrs belonged to it, and that it has included a vast multitude of erudite expositors of later times. We shall show that all these have held to the central truth, that prophecy faithfully mirrors the Church's history as a whole, and not merely a commencing or foreclosing fragment of that history. It is held by many that the futurist school of interpretation is represented chiefly by certain Protestant commentators and teachers who deny that the prophecy of the man of sin relates to the Pope of Rome. We shall show that the futurist school of interpretation, on the contrary, is chiefly represented by teachers belonging to the Church of Rome, that the popes, cardinals, bishops, and priests of that apostate church are all futurists, and that the futurist interpretation is one of the chief pillars of Romanism. Two interpretations of prophecy are before us, the historic and the futurist. The historical school of interpretation regards these prophecies as reflecting the history of the Fourth or Roman Empire in all its most important aspects, from first to last, including especially the dark apostasy, which long prevailed in Christendom, the testimony and sufferings of God's faithful people amid this apostasy, and the ultimate triumph of their cause. On the other hand, the futurist school of interpretation regards these prophecies as dealing almost exclusively with the distant future of the consummation, regards them as dealing chiefly not with what has been for the last 1800 years, but with what will be in some final spasm at the close. The war against the saints waged by the Roman little horn of the prophecies of Daniel, the proud usurpations of the man of sin, and his antagonism to the cause of true religion, foretold by Paul, the blasphemous pretensions and persecuting deeds of the revived head of the Roman Empire, set forth in the prophecies of John, all these are regarded by this futurist school as relating to a brief future period, immediately preceding the Second Advent. The futurist school denies the application of these important practical prophecies to the conflicts of the Church during the last 18 centuries. It robs the Church of their practical guidance all through that period. This is the position taken by the Church of Rome. This is the position taken by the popes, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and other great teachers of that apostate church. This is the prophetic interpretation they have embodied in 1,000 forms and insisted upon with dogmatic authority. This has been the interpretation of proud papal usurpers, of cruel persecutors, of merciless tyrants, of the Romanist enemies of the gospel, and of the saints and servants of God. We shall find, on the other hand, as we study the subject, that the historic interpretation of prophecy, the interpretation which condemns Rome and which Rome consequently condemns, grew up gradually with the progress of events and the development of the apostasy of Latin Christianity, that it slowly modified its details under the illuminating influence of actual facts, but that it retained its principles unaltered from age to age, that it was defended by a multitude of earnest students and faithful expositors, and that it shaped the history of heroic struggles and of glorious revivals of spiritual life and testimony. This is the interpretation whose history during 15 centuries we propose to review. We shall divide these 15 centuries into 3 periods. Number 1, the period extending from apostolic times to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Number 2, the period extending from the fall of the Roman Empire and rise of the papacy in the 5th century to its exaltation under the pontificate of Gregory VII, or Hildebrand, the founder of the papal theocracy in the 11th century. And number 3, the period from Gregory VII to the Reformation. First, then, let us glance at the history of prophetic interpretation in the interval extending from apostolic times to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. This was the period of the so-called Fathers of the Christian Church. A multitude of their writings remain to us, containing not only almost countless references to the prophecies in question, but complete commentaries on Daniel and the Apocalypse. It is boldly claimed by many of the fathers of the first 5 centuries, held by the futurist interpretation of these books. We deny the correctness of this position and assert that the fathers of the first 5 centuries belonged to the historical school of interpretation. It was impossible for them, owing to the early position which they occupied, rightly to anticipate the manner and scale of the fulfillment of these wondrous prophecies. But as far as their circumstances permitted, they correctly grasped their general significance and adhered to that interpretation which regards prophecy as foretelling the whole course of the Church's warfare from the 1st century to the 2nd Advent. It is impossible at this time to do more than present a brief summary of the views of the Fathers on this subject, and to name a few and refer you to their works. Number 1. The Fathers interpreted the 4 wild beasts of prophecy as representing the 4 empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Here we have the foundation of the historical interpretation of prophecy. Take as an instance the words of Hippolytus on the great image and 4 wild beasts of Daniel. The golden head of the image, he says, is identical with the lioness, by which the Babylonians were represented. The shoulders and the arms of silver are the same with the bear, by which the Persians and Medes are meant. The belly and thighs of brass are the leopard, by which the Greeks who ruled from Alexander onward are intended. The legs of iron are the dreadful and terrible beast, by which the Romans who hold the empire now are meant. The toes of clay and iron are the 10 horns, which are to be. The one other little horn springing up in their midst is the Antichrist. The stone that smites the image and breaks it in pieces, and that filled the whole earth, is Christ, who comes from heaven and brings judgment on the world. This statement is remarkable for its clearness, correctness, and condensation, and expresses the view held still by the historic school. Hippolytus says in the treatise on Christ and Antichrist, "Rejoice, blessed Daniel, thou hast not been in error. All these things have come to pass. Already the iron rules, already it subdues and breaks all in pieces. Already it brings all the unwilling into subjection. Already we see these things ourselves. Now we glorify God, being instructed by thee." Number 2, the Fathers held that the 10-horned beasts of Daniel and John are the same. As an instant, Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies, chapter 26, says, "John in the Apocalypse teaches us what the 10 horns shall be, which were seen by Daniel." Number 3, the Fathers held the historic interpretation of the Apocalypse. As Eliot says, none of the Fathers entertained the idea of the apocalyptic prophecy overleaping the chronological interval, were it less or greater, antecedent to the consummation, and plunging at once into the times of the consummation. Here, for example, is the commentary of Victorinus on the Apocalypse of John, written towards the end of the 3rd century. This is the earliest commentary extant on the Apocalypse as a whole. In this, the going forth of the white horse under the first seal is interpreted of the victories of the gospel in the first century. This view, you will observe, involves the historical interpretation of the entire book of Revelation. Victorinus interprets the woman clothed with the sun, having the moon under her feet, and wearing a crown of 12 stars on her head, and travailing in her pain, as the ancient church fathers, prophets, saints, and apostles. In other words, the Judeo-Christian body of saints. He could not, of course, point to the fulfillments, which were at his early date still future, but he recognizes the principle. Number 4, the fathers held that the little horn of Daniel, the man of sin foretold by Paul, and the revived head of the Roman Empire predicted by John, represent one and the same power, and they held that power to be the Antichrist. For example, Origen, in his famous book Against Celsus, thus expresses himself, after quoting nearly the whole of Paul's prophecy about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians, which he interprets of the Antichrist. He says, "Since Celsus rejects the statements concerning Antichrist, as it is termed, having neither read what is said of him in the book of Daniel, nor in the writings of Paul, nor what the Savior in the Gospels has predicted about his coming, we must make a few remarks on this subject. Paul speaks of him who is called Antichrist, describing, though with a certain reserve, both the manner and time and cause of his coming. The prophecy also regarding Antichrist is stated in the book of Daniel, and is fitted to make an intelligent and candid reader admire the words as truly divine and prophetic, for in them are mentioned the things relating to the coming kingdom, beginning with the times of Daniel, and continuing to the destruction of the world." This has been a reading from H. Grattan Guinness's work, Romanism and the Reformation, but I'll continue next time around. Thank you for listening, my fellow Bereans.